أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين فإذا قضيتم الصلاة فاذكروا الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبكم فإذا اطمأننتم فأقيموا الصلاة إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا. Allah Almighty says in the Holy Quran, and when you have finished the prayer, remember Allah while standing and sitting and lying on your sides. And when you are secure from danger, then observe prayer in the prescribed form. Verily, prayer is enjoined on the believers to be performed at fixed hours. Huzur Ayyadahullah Ta'ala bin Ismail Aziz addressed the subject in a recent sermon on combining prayers and how sometimes it is something that is done excessively, and how it can turn into a more dangerous change not only in behavior but in doctrine if it is allowed to continue for too long and to go too far. For example, there are different ways in which sometimes a misguidance or sometimes a misinterpretation creeps into a people. One way is through actions. A person can know the correct circumstances wherein it is permissible to combine prayers. But despite that knowledge, he may still combine the prayers out of his own weakness, out of his own laziness, or whatever the reason is. In that situation, his doctrine is all right. His understanding and his beliefs are fine. But it is his ability to act on that doctrine and on that belief which is weak. And so that is a weakness in action, and that is something that is relatively less of a cause for concern. However, something that is a greater cause for concern is when that weakness in action begins to expand and continues to expand until it starts to affect our very doctrines as well. And that is what Huzur Ayyadahullah Ta'ala described when he said that sometimes some of our children are under the impression that there are only 3 prayers in the day rather than 5. And the reason for that is because that is what some of them have been observing their parents doing. And although they may not have been taught that explicitly, but they have adopted a doctrine that is incorrect because of the sort of sunnah that they are seeing established in front of their eyes, whether it is according to the sunnah of the Holy Prophet ﷺ or not. So this is where a wrong action can turn into something that can be far more deep in its effects. And this is where it is important to understand and to make a correction on that doctrine. So understanding the philosophy behind why prayers are combined, and what circumstances in which prayers can be combined, and what circumstances they should not be combined, and what is the reasoning behind it. That is something that is important to understand, and which is something that we can use in our daily lives. Although this is a subject that going into the details of which is mostly related to fiqh and jurisprudence. It is not necessarily something that is particularly inspiring or something that will improve our spirituality directly. But still it is information that is important for us on a daily basis, because we observe the 5 daily prayers every day. And facing the decision of whether to combine a prayer or not is also something that we face on a daily basis. And so having a correct doctrine in that area can lead us to be able to benefit from the wisdom of why Allah Ta'ala has placed 5 separate congregational prayers during the day. Now, the reason why congregational prayer and the combining of those prayers has been permitted is essentially for the convenience of the congregation. Or more accurately, it can be said to save the congregation from undue inconvenience. And this is something that does not just extend to combining prayers, But it even applies to coming to the masjid for those congregational prayers in the first place. For example, it is narrated in Bukhari that once there was a day where it was particularly bad weather. And when the muazzin was giving azan, Hazrat Ibn Abbas told him to, rather than saying, Hayya al-salat, to come to prayer, he said to him, say, as-salatu fil rihal, that observe prayer where you are, where you presently are. There is no need to come to the masjid in these circumstances. And he said that this is also what the Holy Prophet ﷺ did in similar circumstances. Hazrat Zainul Abidin Waliullah Shah Sahib, in commentary of this hadith, has described that the wisdom why this provision has been given is that if it were not given, then many people would still come to the masjid in those times of inconvenience out of a sense of obligation. And so that obligation is relieved and it is alleviated, so that it does not become an undue source of inconvenience for those people who would have considered it their responsibility to come to the masjid for congregational prayers. This is the same philosophy that applies to combining prayers. For example, if the weather is exceptionally bad, if it is a source of great inconvenience for people to come, then if the prayers were not combined, then some people may, out of their own opinion, or make a decision individually that it is inconvenient to come back to the masjid, and so they may just observe congregational prayers in their home. But there are other people who may come back for that next congregational prayer, and then they would be unduly inconvenienced. And so in this situation, the imam, along with the congregation, have been given the right in Islam to lift that obligation of coming together a second time for congregational prayers, and to be able to combine it with that previous congregational prayer. So there it is to save the congregation from undue inconvenience. Now this also is the same principle that applies wherein coming to the masjid can even be lifted as an obligation, where if the weather or circumstances are particularly inconvenient, exceptionally bad, then there the imam has even been given the right to lift the obligation of even coming to the masjid for congregational prayers in the first place. Now this does not mean that the prayer will be cancelled in the masjid. This doesn't mean that Jumu'ah would not be observed or that prayer would not be observed. But what is written in the title of that hadith in Bukhari is that those who are already gathered can observe their congregational prayers. But it is no longer obligatory for those who are outside to come and to join in that congregational prayer. So this is the basic philosophy behind it. And this is what has to be kept in mind as to why it is that prayers are combined, or even in some situations, in extreme situations, the responsibility of coming to the masjid in the first place can even be alleviated. After this, the question arises as to what are those legitimate reasons wherein prayers can be combined. And also, what about if some of those legitimate reasons exist? Is it necessary to combine prayers in those situations? What's important to remember here is that this is not a black and white issue. Now, sometimes we become passionate about one side of the argument, whether it is to combine or whether it is to not combine. But there is really no situation where we can say that a prayer definitely has to be combined in that situation, or it definitely should not be combined in that situation. Because as has been established by the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and as we find in our fiqh, that there are always exceptions in every situation. For example, there are some situations where a prayer does not have to be combined even for legitimate reasons. For example, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi rahimahullah ta'ala said that when he first came to London, he saw that the Jamaat there was overly in the habit of combining prayers. And so he said that at that time, because people were too much in this habit, even when there were legitimate reasons, like weather conditions that would have necessitated and would have made it convenient for people to combine, he said, even then I did not combine in order to remove this negative habit that had come into people. So what this shows is that even when conditions are there to combine, even then it is not obligatory to combine. Simply because it is raining doesn't mean we have to combine, or simply because it is snowing doesn't mean that it is wrong to read them separately. Then on the other hand, there are certain situations where there is not even a need for a legitimate reason to combine. For example, there is, in some situations, it is narrated once that the Holy Prophet ﷺ combined the prayer even though there was no apparent reason to do so. There was no weather restriction, there was no inconvenience in any other form, but still he combined the prayer in that situation. So it shows in an exceptional situation, not as a regularity, but a prayer can even be combined when there is no legitimate reason to do so. Now some people They sometimes present this reason for not combining prayers, that nowadays there is a difference in the convenience that we have for traveling. Now, in the past, it would have been more difficult and inconvenient to travel to the masjid, to walk to the masjid, and also the masjids were not made as well. They were not ceilings that were as sealed as they are today. And so perhaps those restrictions no longer apply. But even from that line of logic, it is not something that holds water. Because this same line of logic is something that is not applied to fasting. For example, sometimes even today, Muslims say that we do not need to miss fasting because of traveling. Because traveling has become convenient now with cars, with airplanes, and those sorts of things. But Hazrat Masih Maud clarified that when the philosophy of traveling is there as an inconvenience in principle, so their fasting should be abandoned. So in the same way, just because traveling has become easier now does not mean that the reason for combining prayers no longer exists. So basically, when we look at the situation from various angles, from both angles, there is no black and white on that issue. It is not that when there are certain weather conditions, it has to be combined and it cannot be read separately. And we also cannot say that there are certain situations where it cannot be combined. Prayer can even be combined as an exception, even if there is no legitimate reason. So this is an issue that is not necessarily black and white, but it is varying shades of gray. And it is something that has to be decided along with the consultation of the local congregation and under the guidance of the Khalifa of the time. After this, one other question arises, which is that what are those conditions that necessitate the combining of prayers? And how do we define something that is inconvenient by which we can say that prayer should be combined? Now this also again is not a black and white issue, but it is something that is decided according to the region and the place wherein a person is living. For example, the amount of snow that we get here that causes all schools to shut down, there are places in Canada that get that same amount of snow, and they wouldn't even think of considering that to be an inconvenience. They continue with their daily activities, they continue going to the masjid for their daily prayers, and they continue on with their routine. So that is snow, how snow varies as the perception changes based on experience of people in different places in the world. Then also rain is something that varies as well. There's parts in Africa where it rains for months on end and people continue with their daily activities and they observe their prayers separately. In London also, it is a place where it rains extremely regularly, and there also prayers are not combined simply because it is raining. So from that perspective also, it is something that has to be looked at according to local circumstances. Simply because it is snowing does not necessarily mean that prayers have to be combined, and also simply because it is raining does not necessarily mean that prayers have to be combined. But these are all things that are taken into as factors when we are considering what the region it is that decision is being made in. Ultimately, when we look at how it is that we should make this decision, and ultimately it is a decision that has to be made with the consultation of the congregation, and it is not something that is black and white. It has to be done according to the guidance of the Khalifa of the time. So when we look at whatever circumstances we are in, and see whether there is a legitimate reason or not, all of those reasons may exist. But there is one overarching reason that we must take into consideration and keep in mind. And that is what Huzur Ayyadahullah Ta'ala bin Nasril Aziz has pointed out, which is that we as a people, unfortunately, have started to incline more towards the combining of prayers. And that has gone from being a simple weakness in action to ultimately becoming a weakness even in doctrine, where people are starting to change their very doctrines about what it is that necessitates combining of prayer and what it is that 5 daily prayers are as opposed to 3 daily prayers. And so in this situation and in this circumstance, it is our responsibility to incline more towards not combining. As Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi Rahimahullah Ta'ala said, that when he first came to London, when he first migrated there, he saw that people were so much in the habit of combining that he started to never combine the prayers just to remove this habit from them. Even when there were extreme weather conditions and it was necessary there was a legitimate reason and it would have been more convenient for people to combine, even then he did not do so. So this is a similar circumstance that we find ourselves in now. And even if we do find ourselves in legitimate circumstances, this is something that we should begin to incline towards, that not combining in the masjid and also in our homes, just so that we can remove this negative and wrong doctrine that has started to find its way into our lives and into our children in particular. if this type of approach is adopted, and this guidance of the Khalifa at the time is taken into consideration, then it can create a lot more clarity on how to make this decision. As far as I have experienced, I think in every Jamaat, there is always a disagreement. In every local Jamaat, in every local Masjid, there is always some difference of opinion on how prayers should be combined and how they should not. And there's always references to support both sides. At the end of the day, there's never a black and white issue. But one piece of guidance that we can take is this guidance of Huzur Yadawallahu Ta'ala bin Asfir Aziz. And that even though it is something that can go both ways, but the circumstances of these days, especially in these countries, where people have begun to incline in the wrong direction, so there is a need to incline in the opposite direction and to establish the 5 daily prayers on a regular basis and individually. This is something that can help us not only in our masjid lives, but in our personal lives as well. Now, in the masjid it is very important because the masjid is where the example is set, and that is where other people come and they come to observe how things should be done. And so obviously if something is being done which is not ideal in the masjid, then it can be a cause of misguidance on an individual level. But we can also take this to our individual lives as well. That if we are combining on a regular basis within our homes, then this is something that should also be corrected. And we can benefit from the 5 regular prayers that are offered separately. One of the reasons that is given as to why we should combine prayers sometimes is because everyone is gathered together. And so when everyone disperses, everyone's not going to have that same opportunity to observe congregational prayer together in the masjid as they do. However, this also is not a legitimate reason because Huzur Yadawallahu Ta'ala bin Asfir Aziz has emphasized that if a person is not able to make it back to the masjid, if a person lives far away or if he's just not able to come at a particular time, then that prayer should be offered in congregation at his home. If a person is at a far distance, then his home in a way becomes a masjid where he offers his congregational prayer. So if we adopt this line of reasoning, that simply because everyone is gathered together at a certain time, at Zuhr time when there's a local event, and everyone is not going to be able to gather again, so therefore we should combine, then this assumes that people are not observing congregational prayers in their homes in the first place. And so that is also something that is incorrect that has to be corrected, which is that it is our responsibility to observe all 5 prayers in congregation, not necessarily in the masjid each and every one, but if we are not able to make it, then also we can observe it within our homes and fulfill that obligation. Then finally, one other point is that there are 2 types of combining that are permitted. One is Jama'i Takhir and the other is Jama'i Taqdeem, which are described in Fiqh Ahmadiyya. One, which is Jama'i Taqdeem, is to combine the prayers at its earlier time. For example, to combine Asr prayer with Zuhr or to combine Isha prayer with Maghrib. And the other, which is not as preferable, but it is something that is legitimate if there is a legitimate reason to do so, is Jama'i Takhir, which is to combine Zuhr prayer in Asr time or to combine Maghrib prayer at Isha time. So both of these are permissible if there is a legitimate reason to do so. But again, those 5 daily prayers observed separately is something that is important to maintain. When the Holy Prophet ﷺ went on the spiritual journey of Miraj, he was commanded to give his ummah the teaching of 50 prayers on a daily basis. And eventually that number was reduced to 5. And Allah Almighty said that the blessings of 50 prayers will be placed in 5. This number of 5 has a special meaning to it and it has a particular blessing to it. And this number of 5 is something that has to be maintained in our daily lives in order to be able to fully benefit from the congregational prayers. And also it is something that has to be passed down to our children. If it is something that we in action are depriving ourselves of as a blessing, and if as a doctrine we are depriving our children of it from this blessing, then this is something that could precipitate into a greater loss spiritually. So again, although understanding and knowing all these points is not something that will directly improve our spirituality, it is not at all something that is inspiring. It is in fact probably a very boring and tedious subject to go over. The technicalities of the jurisprudence of combining of prayers, what are the legitimate reasons and what aren't, and why it is that we should be encouraged to read them separately. The subject in and of itself might not be something that revolutionizes our spirituality, but acting on this, understanding it and acting on it correctly, is something that will make a great effect in our daily lives. Because again, this is a decision that we have to face on a daily basis. And it is a decision that we do take to an extent very casually at times. And that casual approach can eventually result in serious spiritual consequences, not only within ourselves but within the following generations. So observing the 5 daily prayers in congregation and separately and not combining unnecessarily is something that is very important as a fundamental part of our daily relationship with Allah Almighty as He has commanded. So may Allah Almighty help us to observe our 5 daily prayers with regularity and also with concentration, and to be able to find that pleasure in it wherein it does not seem like a burden anymore, where we feel the need or we feel overly inclined to combine just to be able to rid ourselves of the burden. But if that pleasure begins to be found in it, then we will not really search for excuses to combine prayers to reduce the total number of rakat we have to observe in a day. But the opposite would happen, where a person begins to search for opportunities to observe nawafil and find an excuse to observe prayers, even when it is not something that is obligatory. So may Allah Almighty grant us that pleasure in prayer. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa nu'minu bihi wa natawakkalu alayhi wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. Man yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlilhu fala hadiya lahu. Wa nashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu. ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. There are a few announcements. This is an announcement from Sher Ali Bisharat Sahib. He says that my cousin Zuhra Hasib is undergoing a second back surgery in Pakistan. Please pray that may Allah Almighty grant her speedy and complete recovery. Also, Tahir Academy classes are held on Sundays by the grace of Allah. The class starts at 10:30 a.m. All parents are requested to register their children. A registration form is available. Then Central Virginia Ansar Muntazim Taaleem Tahir Kamar Sahib will be holding a group session right after Jumu'ah in the back for any Ansar members who have not yet done the Taaleem test. Please take some time after Jumu'ah if you have not completed the test. Please pray for all members who are sick and going through treatment. May Allah Almighty grant them full and speedy recovery. Also, finally, the prayers for congregational prayers in the Masjid are as follows. And these are timings that we can note down, and whenever it is possible, if we are close by, and even if it is somewhat inconvenient to come, we should try and come and populate the mosque during these times. So Isha prayer is something that is generally well attended, but Zuhr, Asr and Maghrib are something that we can increase our attendance on in congregational prayers. So Fajr time is at 5:15 a.m., Zuhr is at 1:15 p.m., Asr is at 6 p.m., Maghrib is at 8:15 p.m. and Isha at 9:30 p.m. Ibadallah, rahimakumullah. Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsani wa ita'i zil qurba wa yanha 'anil fahsha'i wal munkari wal baghi ya'izukum la'allakum tazakkarun. Uzkurullaha yazkurkum waduhu yastajib lakum wa lazikrullahi akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.